The actual title of these remarks is Why Societies Go Whoosh. This is a technical term, W-H-O-O-S-H. I'm going to try to give a framework, and it's going to have a certain level of abstraction. It just has 4 moving parts. And I'm going to briefly tell you what they are right now, and then I'm going to try to explain them in a little more detail. The first is preference falsification. And the idea here is that every person on the planet has inside their heads a belief or a desire that no one except for that person knows. It may be a desire that involves injustice or wrongdoing. It may be a desire that involves morality or politics, but no one except you knows about that. Self-silencing is often the reason that no one but you knows about it. Sometimes misdescription by speakers of what they feel and believe is the source. Not quiet, but falsehood. That's my first moving part. The second is diverse thresholds. And here the idea is that for some of us, if we see something unjust or troublesome, we are there instantaneously. Our threshold for thought or action is really low. Others have very high thresholds. In fact, such high thresholds that unless basically everyone they know is saying or doing the relevant thing, they won't do the relevant thing. Most people are in between. They're not like 0 threshold people, and they're not like near infinite threshold people. They have to be roused. My third moving part, aside from thresholds and preference falsification, is interdependencies, which signals just the fact that most of what we say or do, at least with respect to morality or politics, is reactive to what other people are saying or doing. If one person is saying or doing something, we might think, crazy person. If 1,000 are, we might think, why haven't I joined them yet? If you put together those 3, preference falsification, diverse thresholds, and interdependencies, I think we're on the road toward understanding the slide to my right and to my left, how that could have happened. But we have to add one more, the 4th moving part, and it's group polarization. When like-minded people get together, they often end up, after talking to one another, more confident, more unified, and more extreme. If you put together group polarization with preference falsification, diverse thresholds, and social interdependencies, now we're in business at explaining unpredictable social movements and revolutionary activity. Okay, preference falsification means that we live in a world of pluralistic ignorance in which we are ignorant of what other people actually think. Even in societies which aren't oppressive in the sense of authoritarian, human beings often conceal or don't reveal what they actually want. They might say that the status quo is fine when they don't think that, or they might say nothing about the status quo, which means their friends and neighbors might have absolutely no idea what they actually think. For those who want to predict a social movement, the problem is that social norms can draw a wedge between what people express publicly and what they believe privately. The law matters if freedom of speech is violated and if dissent is punished. But even if there's no restriction on freedom of speech, if people will be shunned or disliked or compromised in some way, they might not merely silence themselves. They might say that they're happy with the status quo when they aren't at all. Now let's turn to the matter of diverse threshold. Different people will require different levels of social support before they will join a movement or say what they think. Some people are rebels by nature. Every one of us knows one, yes? Some of you look like you might be them. Let's call them, rebels, without being pejorative, zeros, not because the number connotes low, but because they will act even if they have zero social support. They might well be isolated. No one may join them, in which they may look nuts or at least radical. Other people, and this is more common, require at least a little social support. They won't move unless someone else does, but if someone else does, they'll be prepared to rebel too. Let's call them the ones. They need one person. Others require more than a little, and you know what we're going to call them? This is fancy math here. The twos. The twos won't do a thing unless they see the zeros and the ones. But if they do, they're going to move too. The twos, of course, are followed by threes and tens and hundreds and thousands, all the way up to the infinites, defined as people who aren't going to oppose the status quo no matter what. Now, here's the kicker. Outside of science fiction, it's not possible to see people's thresholds. We may not ourselves know whether we're zeros, ones, twos, or threes, or fours on particular issues. We might be surprised to find we're twos when we thought we were tens, or that we're hundreds when we thought we were threes. We might turn out to be really surprised. Interdependence points to the fact that the behavior of the ones, the twos, and threes depends on who sees whom doing what and exactly when. To see how the conditions might be ripe for this slide to work, and this is eerily descriptive of a book on the unanticipated Iranian Revolution. Here the conditions are right. The zeros go first. They move. Then the ones see them, they move too, then the twos, then the threes, and so forth. Under those assumptions, a rebellion's going to occur given two things: the right distribution of thresholds, the right kind of visibility, and the right kind of interactions. It's crucial to see the conditions have to be just right. If there are no zeros, or if no one sees any zeros, we're not going to get that. Nothing's going to happen. If there are a few ones, the status quo is likely to be safe. If most people are hundreds or thousands, no worries, even if there are some ones, twos, threes, and fours. Okay, preference falsification, thresholds, interdependencies, and here's my fourth and last piece. I did a study a few years ago of climate change believers, basically worried about climate change. I got them to talk to each other for a short period and then to record anonymously their views about climate change. They recorded their views anonymously before they talked, then they recorded their views anonymously after they talked. Here's what happened. At first, the group was, on average, concerned about climate change. There was diversity of opinion. After they talked, everyone in the group was terrified about climate change, and they were unanimous. The little group went whoosh as a result of basically 45 minutes of conversation. At the same time, I created a little group of people not concerned, actually several, not concerned about climate change. Not unconcerned, but not concerned, not very concerned. There was diversity in that group. Some thought an international agreement was probably a good idea, some weren't sure. But basically, on average, they weren't worried about climate change. As a result of discussions with relatively like-minded people, that group became wholly unconcerned about climate change. It ended up thinking the idea of an international agreement to control greenhouse gas emissions was terrible. And they were unanimous about that in their private expressions of view, guaranteed anonymity. What we saw in both groups was polarization to more extreme point in line with their antecedent tendency, and with respect to issues that I bet you're thinking about, exactly that has been witnessed recently in, let's say, this country, where people associating with like-minded others go to a more extreme, unified, confident position, and so do others. I certainly observe this in my country. The group polarization phenomenon, created artificially in the climate change experiment, is created naturally every minute of every day online via Twitter, which are machineries for associations among like-minded people. Okay, if we put these factors together, the mystery with which I began, I think, starts to dissolve. We can now see why large movements, including revolutions, may be impossible to predict. First, we don't know what people's preferences are. By hypothesis, they can't be observed. They're in people's heads. Second, we can't know what people's thresholds are. They too are unobservable. Which people are 2s, 3s, and 4s? In the Iranian case, the historical studies show that many participants in the revolution had no idea that they were 3s or 4s, but once things started going, they sure found out. Third, and this is the most important point of the three, we can't anticipate social interactions. We can't say who will say, we can't know in advance who will say do what and exactly when. Even if we knew people's preferences and could know their thresholds, we can't know in advance who's going to interact with whom, the 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s. This suggests that even if new technologies make it increasingly possible to identify private preferences, and they do, by Google searches you can learn what's in people's heads more than ever before. That's knowable. But even if you can do that, you aren't going to be able to predict social movements. You'll know something important. If people secretly hate some practice or status quo, the likelihood of a successful movement is higher, but that's not sufficient. We need to know people's thresholds, and that's really hard. Even if we could overcome that obstacle, we need to know the interactions. Who's seeing whom when? Whether people will move depends on whether they see other people moving. And other things being equal, the increased visibility of others will increase the likelihood that people will move. So we should see, other things being equal, more social movements brewing as a result of social media and the internet than we otherwise would. There's a political scientist named Gary King who studied the behavior of the Chinese government with respect to social media, with considerable cooperation, interestingly, from the Chinese government. And his basic finding is, if people on Chinese social media, citizens of China, say negative things about the government, it's not censored. If you say the government is doing bad things, the leaders are making mistakes, even if it has a degree of commitment and energy in it, evidently it's allowed. The response might be to add material to the stream that is very positive, so people see, and this is the countervailing, see positive things. But it's kind of, there's a degree of allowance. By contrast, if people on social media say, we're having a meeting at this specific place on Thursday night, we've got 400 people coming, please join us, that will be taken down. And that's smart in terms of an understanding of how social movements take off, because the meeting and the reference to large numbers of people already attending loosens the norms that falsify preferences, suggests the thresholds are being met, and try to get out the 3s and 4s and 5s, and are kind of real virtual evidence of social interactions suggesting we're going to go whoosh a little bit. And so social media monitoring on the part of private or public sectors can be enlisted to cease this stuff. It's intriguing to think how a good government should think about things in the context of protest movements that challenge it. One bit of data that's highly relevant to your question and quite recent is that we know if you want to produce more sustainable behavior, more environmentally friendly behavior, if you draw attention not to people already doing the thing, but to the emerging norm in favor of doing the thing, where fill the thing, I'm being very articulate with that word, with environmentally good behavior of one or another kind. You say increasingly people are doing this. That can be effective in creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's connected with overcoming the threshold problem and the social interactions problem.